And to tell us more about today's verdict against former President Park Geun-hye, Professor Song Se-ryun from Kyung Hee University joins us in the studio today. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
All right, so the court has sentenced former President Park Geun-hye to 24 years in prison. Now, before we go into that, can you first give us an overview of what happened since her arrest in March 2017 up until today?
Right, it was March 17 last year, so it was about a year. She was arrested and kept into custody right away because of destruction of evidence or that she might flee. So she's been in prison, and there were several notable moments where her fate was taking a turn. One was adding extra counts for NIS bribery charges, and also she refused to participate in the judicial proceedings last October. So since then, she has been an absent figure in trials. And also, I think that today's proceedings shows that the court is putting more responsibility on the president, the higher responsibility in terms of constitution. So there are a lot of things to unpack.
Now, like you said, Park has boycotted court sessions since last October, and as expected, she didn't attend the verdict today. So how did that go in this regard?
Right. As expected, it was not a positive point, and also the court kind of specifically mentioned that there was no contrite gestures at all. So the court considered it as kind of derogation of her constitutional duty to uphold the judicial system and the constitutional duty to be faithful in the institutions that we have.
Now, let's get to the most important part then. I mean, what was the verdict against Ms. Park?
Well, as you mentioned, there's a 24-year sentence to go with 18 billion won to be assessed on her.
And how many sentences? There were some cases or charges against her as well, too.
Right. There were 18 counts. At this point, there are a couple more coming, but at least 16 of them were found guilty, except for those charges where the court considered the prosecution's evidence as insufficient or depleted.
Then how does Ms. Park's sentencing compare to that of Choi Soon-sil, her close confidant?
Well, Choi Soon-sil got 20 years. So I think what was expected was that she'll get at least 20 years. So it's in the range of expectation that the court considered the responsibility or the culpability of President Park heavier than what Choi Soon-sil did.
Right, but it's definitely less than the 30 years that prosecutors had called on for, right?
Right, because of those counts that were found not guilty, so they kind of subtracted that.
Okay.
Now, it's still a heavy sentence, if you think about it.
Yeah.
It's tantamount to a life sentence.
I mean, considering that Ms. Park is 66 years old now, 24-year sentence means that, does that mean that she'll be in prison until she's like 90 years old?
Yeah, even 90.
Wow.
Depending on what happens in the appeal, if there is an appeal. But if it stands, then we're looking at 90-year-old release date, probably very heavy. Now,
there has been a lot of interest over figures related to this massive corruption scandal involving President Park Geun-hye. Now, tell us more about them.
Right. Other than the Choi Soon-sil, who is kind of a perpetrator in most of the acts, and President Park, former President Park, got the heavier sentence because she was considered an accomplice, not the accessory accomplice to it. So whatever Choi Soon-sil did, same can be applicable to President Park. We heard a list of probably all the upper 10 chaebol companies, the big companies. They were all involved in this. And we know that the biggest fish they thought of all was Samsung chairman Lee Jae-yong.
Right.
But on appeal, his case was gotten a lenient degree, and he was released on a suspended sentence. So that might be an implication where there might be a chance, I think it's a slim chance, but there might be a chance that if the former President Park appeals, there might be some room for further leniency.
Now, I think what's interesting was that this sentencing was televised live, and Arirang News also televised this live. And I think this was the first broadcast for a verdict of a trial from a district court to be televised. So what was behind this decision?
Right. The first in Korea, not in other countries. In the U.S. has a regular program or the separate channel that dedicates to court proceedings. But in Korea this time around, it reflects the intense interest of the people. And also because of this is the proceedings about the former president, I think there is a national interest and also something to be learned, I guess. But I guess you have to kind of counter that with other interests, such as privacy or whether this would create the prejudice against this. For example, one of the arguments was that this is the trial court decision, so if it goes to the appeal, the final verdict is yet to come.
Yeah.
So if it creates some sort of prejudice in the public that the sentence is what she deserves, probably it's unfair. But the court has rejected that argument already.
But then the trials and sentencing of Samsung Electronics Lee Jae-young as well as Choi Soon-sil were not broadcast because the defendants said that they did not consent to their trials being filmed or televised. And we heard that former President Park also didn't want the proceedings to be televised or filmed, but it didn't go that way. So what's the difference there?
Right. It's between the gambit of court's discretion. I think that their main criteria of allowing this and not the others would be that this is a proceeding against the former president who has the responsibility to uphold the Constitution, and the significance of this sentencing is more from a public policy point of view or a public goods point of view, more meaningful to the public. But I think that interpretation could be in many people's minds overreach, because this has become kind of a interest as to how many years she would get rather than the substance of it.
Let's go back in history a little bit. I mean, she's not the first president to be arrested and charged. So tell us how things went with former presidents who kind of walked in the same path.
Well, it's not a happy story. Now, we saw the sentencing of President Park. President Lee Myung-bak is in jail. President Roh Moo-hyun committed suicide under similar circumstances. If we go back, there's Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo standing in the same proceedings before. So you could say that there's several interpretations possible. One is what was prominently figured with today's sentencing is that there is an unfortunate tradition of close illegal nexus between the politics and the business. And that has gone on. We know that. The expectation is it would have cleared up by now, but it hasn't. So that aspect of it is there. But the other aspect is it's somewhat structural. The presidency, we kind of express it as a imperial presidency of Korean Blue House. But whatever a president says or even mentions is translated or goes down as a direct order of the president. So I think that looking back, there are quite a number of occasions where a president didn't even mean to, probably, but it was translated or received subjectively as a compelling or the direct order. I think we heard from the sentencing as well, a lot of the Jebel Chong-su's case, the head of the Jebel's case, the court relied on their subjective kind of mindset that when the president says something, they received it as something that should be followed. If not, there would be some sort of retribution, and that justified a lot of compelling charges. I think it makes sense, but at the same time, it's a circumstantial at best. So I think there's some, that was the defense counsel's argument, but I think the controversy will still continue.
And I know this is stretching this a little bit, but I mean, today's sentencing is definitely a shock to a lot of people. I mean, it's 24 years in prison for a former president who has been ousted. So how do you think this could affect possibly the constitutional revision, which obviously seeks to deviate power from the president more to the National Assembly and to the people? So it's still in the parliament and it's still waiting to be passed. But what do you think how do you think this could impact that?
I think there is a considerable impact to the extent that it is structural. The imperial presidency has a room for abuse, but at the same time, if it goes to the court of law, it's very hard to prove innocent action out of it. So I think it is positive that we're talking about presidency as having more of a checks and balances. This proposed the amendment of the Constitution, either from the president's side or the opposition side, that both talks to or envisions some sort of decentralized power centers. Right. So in that sense, I think this is kind of a data point to justify the fact that we have to change the Constitution in terms of top governance.
But then, you know, there are questions over as to giving more power to the National Assembly because, yeah, presidents have been arrested and charged, but then the public has a lot of distrust in politicians as well.
Right. So that's why the LKP party, Liberal Korea Party's proposal might make sense at some point, but at this point, as you mentioned, given the level of distrust of the National Assembly, the question of whether we should give more power to the Prime Minister, who they are contending they should be elected in the National Assembly, whether they should be one of the power centers. Right? I think that if it works well in a parliamentarian system, there might be a chance where the president and also the prime minister might work together well. But those examples are kind of rare and far in between. So if we were going that route, which is perfectly okay, but we have to solve many other problems before we get to that degree.
So I guess at this point, coming back, what's next for President Park now the sentencing has been out?
The immediate question is whether she would appeal. I think she should appeal, not just for her individual, because if it is finalized, then we're looking at the practically life sentence.
Right.
But from a scholar's point of view and even from the general public's point of view, we probably would be better served to look at it further from the appellate court's point of view, and looking at it from a more, other than the trial court, the Supreme Court and also appellate court, it tends to be more esoteric about it. I think it would serve us well looking at this question very closely and not really be swayed by sentiments as much as possible.
How do you think this news will be received by others around the world, I guess? I mean, obviously there are going to be reports out there now.
I'm curious about that, and then actually I did the informal polling too. I think that, especially from the U.S. media, they are surprised by the severity of this action. Even when this whole thing blew over, the kind of attitude or the opinion of the foreign press is that, well, it's a case of kitchen cabinet run amok, which is, usual in the U.S. And if you think about what Donald Trump is talking about, the businesses these days, trash and fake media and all those, it's something that if you're the business, it's a matter of just ignoring it or not just following it as the court thinks that the business has reacted. So there's a surprise there. I think that the best response from our point of view is that Korea has developed this heightened sense of social justice over the years. I mean, we're talking about the long marches and public protests,
but candlelight vigilance.
The whole history of democratization has to do with demanding more on the top governance side. So this is probably a kind of apex of what happened in our political history. We'll look back, obviously, years from now and say we overdid it or underdid it, but this is definitely a landmark case.
Yeah, we've come a long way, definitely. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you.